day, as a result of putting in personal effort, the things that we feel are missing will actually be delivered. So all of that because of an uncomfortable feeling that's there. And so someone who's found that was their experience of life, they went through and a process of change happened, and at some point the seeking stops. And why does the seeking stop? The seeking stops because the suffering diminishes. And so on this basis, we could conclude that actually what I'm really looking for in life is the end of suffering. And what's another way of phrasing the end of suffering? It's peace of mind in daily living. Because suffering in its different forms, guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, are essentially a mental movement or a feeling, which at the root of the feeling there's a mental story that is disturbing our experience. And so when that suffering slows down or ends, then the absence of suffering is what we can call peace of mind. And so if a person who's gone through this process really looks honestly and curiously, like, I wonder what changed. Like, along the way, the methodology presents a whole lot of information. And sometimes we believe the methodology, believe the pointers, and think, oh, that's why pieces settled in. For example, some methodologies might tell us that the world is unreal and the person is unreal. And as we go through that process and we start to see what is meant by that, and maybe come to see life through a particular lens, maybe a new lens of seeing life as a dream or unreal, change happens. Change is always happening. As we get new information in, we're being changed. So if we follow these teachings that say life is unreal, the person is unreal, it's all an illusion, we might actually come to see life through that lens. It's new conditioning after all. The teachings are giving us new conditioning. And if we see life through that lens, then change happens. But what is the change? Because at some point we might suddenly have this flash that the person doesn't exist. The person is intrinsically one with the experience of life. Now, is that flash, that realization, is it the truth? Now, often realizations and insights have this quality to them that make it seem radically different to what we saw before. And there's a quality that this is truth, or this is now I know. What we find with insights, if we are observant, is that insights change. You have an insight, and then it gets refined. So afterwards, down the track, it gets refined. So maybe an insight is not as absolute as it seems when it hits us. And so what I'm getting at is, if we have this insight that I am one with the world, I as the person, and that the world is essentially a creation or an experience, we might think, especially if peace starts to settle in, we might think that the peace is settling in because I've seen the world as unreal. I've seen the person as unreal. I'd suggest it's not the case. Peace hasn't settled in because the person has been seen as unreal. What has probably happened simultaneous to seeing life differently to before, especially seeing it this way as the teachings describe, what's fallen away is the capacity to believe that the person is the doer of what happens in life. And as a result of that particular belief about who we are falling away, we tend to find that we become more and more familiar with a connection to source, we could say, or a connection to ourself, connection to the core of the human that was essentially covered up by this belief in personal doership. And then experientially we might realize that what I am at my core is not affected by outcomes, that I remain complete at my core. And so as a result of seeing life as a dream, let's say, or life as an illusion, the implications of that are quite significant. The implication is to see that I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer, and that my happiness is not dependent on outcomes, that what I am at my core is actually self-confirming and self-contenting. Now, if the main teaching is not of doership and attachment to outcome, if the main teaching is of trying to highlight that life is an illusion or an appearance in consciousness, and then as a result of that teaching, an insight happens, and then life is seen through that lens, and then peace starts to kick in. More and more peace, less and less suffering. The suffering, when it arises, is witnessed as a happening in the dream. Is it because life has been seen as a dream that the peace is kicking in? Or is it that seeing life through a particular lens is undoing certain beliefs, particularly the beliefs in doership and the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes? And what if what is really significant is the changing of those beliefs, which sometimes a teaching won't even directly mention, but they're being undone anyway, indirectly, as a result of seeing life differently? And my point here is that actually the way we might be seeing life, the way it's described, may not be as we end up living life after the process comes to an end. What might happen is that we find ourselves living life as if life is real, because maybe life is real. Maybe life isn't a dream. Yeah.
I can see what you're saying, but there's some slight difference I find. Like, let's say someone says horses can fly.
Mm-hmm.
But no matter how much you believe that person or whatever, you're not really going to see horses fly. But when someone says all is consciousness,
mm-hmm.
at some point it's possible that a direct experience of that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So slightly different than just a...
Sure.
Yeah,
it's not just a blind belief.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why is it that, or what other possibility could there be for the awakening experiences that we have? The awakening experiences are usually a shift, an experiential shift, and qualitatively, all the way down to the sense of what the subject is, there's change, radical change. And in the awakening experience, it becomes clear that the whole experience is arising in consciousness. And so if that experientially gets recognized as an experiential shift, And if teachings have been telling us that life is an arising in consciousness, and the consciousness it arises in is being referred to as God, and therefore it is an arising in God, a creation of God, unfolding according to God's will. And if that shift happens, then it makes sense that the descriptions that supported the shift are then used and assumed to be accurate, to be quasi-truth or even truth, because the shift is now showing me that life is not as I thought. Life is not happening outside me, but rather inside the awareness that is aware of it. So I have no issue with the fact that these qualitative shifts in consciousness happen. And they can then be a significant part of someone's process because they start to support a completely different way of seeing life. But is it the shift that brings about the change? And if it is the shift, what is the shift? Is it a shift to seeing the reality of life as an arising in consciousness? So let's look at another possibility of why this shift, this qualitative shift, could happen. It could be something in the brain that shifts and creates a different experience because the brain has changed. Would you agree with that?
Could be. But also could be that there's no brain in the first place, and the brain is an apparent, something that's apparent because of the way the experience is constructed.
Yep, great. Okay, so we'll take it from there. So it could be because of a shift in the brain. Now, because we've been told, usually, along with the teachings that bring about this change, there is no brain. Cause and effect is actually just apparent. And this is a beautifully synchronized experience, all arising spontaneously in consciousness to appear like a story of time and space. Sounds familiar? This is what I say often. Right? What I'm putting forward here is something that might highlight a really important point for our seeking. And that is that it's the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes that ultimately are what bring about the end of suffering. And if we come to realize this, and I want to go through a progression as to why this is, and following the line of discussion that you've brought up. If we see this, suddenly our search will become very, very much more focused. Attention will become focused on something that it maybe wasn't as focused on before. If this line of questioning I'm unraveling here is understood. So if this shift happens, and we're told before the shift happens that life is actually an appearance in consciousness in God, and what you are is not the body, or what you are is the awareness that is aware of everything that is happening, including the body, aware of the body, that the consciousness that you are witnesses everything, including the body, which is an object inside the experience. So if that shift happens, then automatically there is going to be an assumption that that statement that we heard before is wisdom, is truth, or at very least is pointing at the truth of the matter which has now revealed itself. And is there another explanation for this? And as I suggested, it could be that what we heard and what we started contemplating on, and that as we started really focusing on life differently to before, something shifts in the brain and creates a qualitatively different experience. Because from one perspective, all experience is actually regulated by the brain. And so if the brain changes as part of the course of life, then it makes sense that the qualitative nature of the experience can change. Let's say it's not specifically because of a shift in the brain, but rather a shift of focus. If we acknowledge that if there is an objective body in an objective world, if we assume that there is an objective body in an objective world, so let's say that is where our experience of life comes from an objective body experiencing an objective world. And someone would say, my experience that has shifted proves to me that this isn't the case. Because my experience, my direct knowing, is that I am the awareness that is aware of the body. I am the awareness that is aware of all of the objects, and they all arise inside what I am as this awareness. And essentially, I am prior to the experience. I am not after the experience. So that would be the argument put forward. And so what if we could come up with an explanation of why the experience feels like that, and it's not because of the brain really physically changing. An explanation is that if the world is observed by an objective being in it, and it works something like the experience suggests to us, we see objects because light bounces off them. The light bounces off what we're assuming in this explanation here, off an actual solid object that is real. So light bounces off that, is received by the eyes, the instrument, and then that information is projected into the brain and processed by the brain and projected into the mind of the individual. This is what science would tell us is happening. And so if that's the case, our experience of life moment to moment, which feels like we are seeing the objective world, is actually always an image inside the mind of the individual. So what we experience moment to moment is never actually the objective world, but always an image of the objective world that is projected into the brain/mind of the individual. So one interesting fact that science points out, I'm not using science to say this is absolutely what it is, I'm just introducing another notion, another explanation. Science says that the eye actually receives the image in an inverted form. If you put something at the back of the lens and you see what is projected onto that screen, it's in its inverted form. The brain then receives an inverted image, and before projecting it onto the consciousness of the human being, flips the image. So what is received is an image that is first received upside down, inverted, and then flipped, and then recognized by the consciousness of the individual. So the experience of life is always the experience of an image that does arise in consciousness of the human being. And so this means that if prompted, if the human being is prompted, it makes sense that the awareness of the image can shift, and it's simply a way of perceiving the image within the human being that creates this qualitative shift of being the witness of everything that arises inside of it. Because in fact, if there is an objective human and an objective world, the experience of life is always an image of that objective world, experienced within the consciousness of the human being. And so this qualitative shift of witnessing and feeling like the whole world arises inside what I am is actually accurate, but it doesn't, from this perspective, support the idea that life is a spontaneous arising inside consciousness of God. Now, I like the idea that life is a dream, an illusion, arising spontaneously in the consciousness of God, and that consciousness of God is linked to each of the body-mind organisms, and is functioning through those body-mind organisms in order to have a personal experience from the perspective of this individual. If you had to ask me to lay my bets, I would say that life is some sort of virtual reality. Either man-made, and outside of the virtual reality there are an advanced civilization, and they might in fact actually be a creation in the mind of consciousness, the mind of God, or it's nothing to do with humans outside of this experience, and there is nothing outside of this experience. God has become the experience of life. I'm completely open to both, because I don't know, based on an intimate, first-hand experience of this shift, where life is experienced very radically differently. I can't tell you what it is. But what is more important, that in a period of time, while looking at life from this impersonal perspective, looking at it as a creation in consciousness, what became very apparent is that if life is a spontaneous arising in source or consciousness or God, and that essentially all there is source, consciousness, God, and what we all are is source, consciousness, God, it becomes very clear that what happens in each moment is not my doing or your doing. That you and I are essentially one with the story of life. Now, this is probably a bit confusing because I'm flipping between two different possibilities. Either it's life is an objective reality, or it's a spontaneous arising in source, in God. So we're starting with the it's a spontaneous arising in source, in God. When the qualitative shift happens such that it can be observed or witnessed from both inside and outside, in a way, the experience, then what becomes clear is that life is a happening, not my doing. That what happens in the story of life is essentially like a dream, like a movie. The script has been written, and the movie's being played, acted and played. And so Ramesh used to say that the movie has been written, acted, directed, produced, and it's in the can. And what's really significant in that is that I'm not the doer of what happens through me, and the other isn't the doer of what happens through them. And as we learn that the core of who we are, not only learn but actually experience that the core of who we are is something that was previously unrecognized, and that there is a place to rest. A place outside of all of the thinking that was previously trying to direct what happens in life. As we find this resting, because now we're not worried about controlling life, we're actually resting and witnessing life unfold. We come to find that, from this place of resting and witnessing, I find that I am at peace regardless of what's happening in the movie. regardless of what the body is doing and what the others are doing. So the body is no longer essentially who I know myself as. I'm resting in something much more subjective, something much more unaffected by what happens to the body. And as this happens, we find there's less suffering and more peace. But why is there less suffering and more peace? Is it because I've seen that I am not the body, and that the body is not real, and that life is not real? Or is it because while seeing that, or at least believing that, or a combination of the two, something very significant has happened, and that is that certain beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome, on which all of the suffering used to stem from, have fallen away. And what is undeniable is that even if life is a creation in consciousness, it still unfolds as if we are the person. Seeing life as illusory doesn't actually mean that we walk through walls. It doesn't mean that we stop needing to eat. So after this recognition, life carries on more or less as it did before on a practical level. We're forced to live our life as the human being. We don't suddenly live life as impersonal consciousness. There might be a witnessing of life as a happening, but there is still a sense that I am somehow very intimately connected to a very particular body-mind organism. The experience is that when food goes into this particular body-mind organism, it's tasted. Whereas when food goes into another body-mind organism, it's not tasted. And if a hammer were to hit this finger, it's very much felt. Whereas if a hammer hits someone else's finger, it's not felt. And so the idea that I am formless awareness and not the content is not exactly how we end up living life. We end up living life as if we are the person. And because that, when it really settles in, tends to mean that I have to stop saying things like, I am not the body. We find more and more so that if we start looking critically at what's left, we find that there is still an experience of time and space. There is still an experience of a person. And so in practical terms, the idea that life is not real, life is an illusion, actually is completely contradictory to how life continues to present. And as we align more and more with that fact, so really starting to recognize, actually, a year ago, 5 years ago, I was convinced that this is an illusion. This is not real. But more and more, my life presents on a day-by-day basis very much as if this is real. Then we start questioning, is it really unreal? Just because certain shifts that witnessed life from a different perspective, did it really prove to me that life is not real? And let's assume that the suffering has fallen away completely. And when we start questioning, is it true that it's not real? do I really know that? If I don't overlay some pretty big assumptions that I assume are truth onto the experience. So if I start to recognize that I might be being a bit overzealous with my conviction that it's all an illusion, and we start questioning it, and then I start coming back to the experience, and I go, actually, it's sort of still pretty real. And if someone were to hit me over the head with a piece of wood, the experience of life ceases, and I don't have the experience that I am formless awareness, but it continues to unfold as if I'm the body. So as we think about this more and more, and then we start saying, actually, I'm not so sure that it's not real. And we start acknowledging, I'm the body. I'm the person. I'm the person. And yet the suffering doesn't come back. So why doesn't the suffering come back? It must mean that the suffering didn't go away because life is not real, or life is seen to be unreal. Because if I start questioning that, and then start saying, well, actually it makes much more sense to go with the experience as it continues to present after these realizations, and that is, that in practice it's pretty real. The suffering doesn't come back. So that tells me something significant. That tells me that the suffering ended because of something much more specific than I might be recognizing. And I would suggest that the reasoning is the end of personal doership and attachment to outcome. The end of those beliefs that the person used to have, and the person that is still here now no longer has those beliefs. And why were those beliefs dissolved? They were dissolved because for a while, for a long time, life was taken to be something that it may actually not be. So this is not a bad thing. This means the teachings are not a bad thing at all. They've brought about required change. They've done it in a particular way. We're told not to necessarily believe teachings. They're pointers. Use them as guides. Don't mistake the pointers for truth. And so if someone might say to, but Nisargadatta told me this, or Jesus told me this, or Ramana told me this. Yes, that was the teaching. And but they also told me this, and so, but it seems like you're believing the teaching. The teaching tells you not to believe the teaching. The teaching will do what it needs to do, work with what it has, make the change on the level of the body-mind organism in order for suffering to no longer be a product of the person. Meaning for the person no longer to be designed in such a way that the suffering can be produced. So as we describe it in the teaching I normally put forward, which is the teaching that Ramesh used to put forward, is we don't need to look at life as a dream. What we really need to focus on is the notion of personal doership and attachment to outcome. Bring our attention right onto what through another method actually gets addressed, actually falls away, which is, as we've been looking at, this belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And so we can address this through another methodology. The other methodology is to look at the human being and see why is it that they function the way they do in each moment. Why is it that I, in each moment, function the way I function? Is it because I am the doer, in complete control of everything I say, think, and do? Or is there another reason? And the concept put forward is that the human being is one way in each moment, a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. On a biological and psychological level, the human being is one way in each moment based on these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that the human being has never been in control of. That means that we find ourselves in each moment in a particular situation. We need to act in a situation, making choices, and we will act in the particular situation exactly as we are destined to act, exactly as we are designed to act, according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. That means that the human being essentially can be likened to a chemical that has a very specific composition in a particular moment, and the chemical finds itself in an environment, maybe comes across another chemical that has a specific composition, and then there's a reaction that happens, and the reaction is not personal. The reaction is what is destined to happen based on the makeup of the two chemicals and the situation they're in, the atmosphere they're in, the setting they're in. So what we considered to be my doing, which is how we've looked at our life historically and looked at the other as something that I am controlling, I am creating based on my own free will, based on the notion that there is an entity in here that is completely unaffected by anything else and makes decisions in complete isolation. So it means it can make a decision in isolation of anything else. That's the doer. It's not really a doer, it's a belief in a doer. So the belief in a doer does not make.
Even the idea that there's partial control is also equally flawed, it feels.
Yes. So the idea that there is partial control is flawed.
Yeah, because often it can be felt that, okay, I'm affected by life circumstances, but there's somewhere inside, there's some sort of little bit capacity that's equally flawed as well, I feel.
If you come to see what's being described, there's just no space, zero space for the notion that I'm in control of anything. This is not at all how we tend to relate to life. Not at all how we tend to relate to ourselves or the other. It is funny. So what's being put forward here is a concept. It's a description of dynamics that, to me, if you put a little bit of common sense into it and look at the dynamic that's being described, that essentially the human being grows when the sperm and the egg come together. That's the genetic structure of the human coming in place, and then that genetic structure grows, and the genetic structure is not ever in isolation from the external world, which we can call new conditioning in each moment. So a combination of the genetic structure of the human being plus the impact of life moment after moment after moment makes us something particular in each moment, one way. And we're forced to function that way. There's no other part of ourself that is separate from this process of genes and up-to-date conditioning. We have an imagination, which is also part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So our belief systems, our opinions, our idea is all part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, how we've been grown. And so this fantasy of a doer, the fantasy of being a separate independent entity, unaffected by anything else, meaning being independently volitional, that fantasy is part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning that was put in place by life. So whenever guilt or blame or pride arises, if what I'm sharing becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning, it's new conditioning that can affect the makeup of the human being, such that they are different in the next moment. So if the up-to-date conditioning is affected, then when suffering arises in the form of guilt, blame and pride, maybe a little bit of space will exist whereby a part of us witnesses the suffering and says, oh, look, there it goes again. There's that belief that life put in place, the belief that says, I am the doer of what happens through me and what happens in life. And the belief is now feeling guilty for not having been good enough. And if that happens, it's not our doing. If that witnessing happens, if the witnessing of suffering happens, it's not our doing. It's how we, on a biological and psychological level, have been shaped by life. So the freedom from suffering, and in the case I'm speaking about here, there's a witnessing of the suffering, which means still the uncomfortableness of the guilt, but something looking at it and going, I don't really believe this. This is weird. It's one, and the reason is because the beliefs of personal doership haven't been completely uprooted. They still exist in the body, at the same time as the deepening idea that the belief in personal doership is ridiculous. It's unfounded based on an investigation of my own. And the investigation is to take this concept of genes and up-to-date conditioning, and as life unfolds, we start to see, yes, I reacted based on the circumstance I found myself in and my particular makeup. I'm short-tempered, or I'm fearful, or I'm timid. I found myself in a particular situation, and as a result of my makeup, I reacted in a timid way or in a short-tempered way. And I used to take that as something I shouldn't have done. I should do it differently. Now, this doesn't mean that that reaction to life, which is a happening, is not going to be painful. We might be short-tempered, and that short temper is experienced as pain, not pleasure. It's not in line with our preferences. And it might deliver more pain because people might yell back or be aggressive back or decide they don't want to spend time with us. So the consequence, the action, the happening, is in itself painful, and the consequence might be painful. So we're not diminishing the fact that it can have pleasure or painful consequences. But the fact is that both the happening, the action of short-temperedness, and the consequence are not my doing. I get angry according to the circumstance and my genes and up-to-date conditioning. The other person, according to their genes and up-to-date conditioning, get even angrier. So we receive pain from two ends. That's part of the flow of life. That's just pleasure or pain. Our suffering is never to be found in the flow of life. Our suffering is to be found in our attitude to the flow of life. And with the attitude of personal doership, we have the pain of us getting angry, the pain of the other getting angry, and then we have a load of suffering. Guilt for losing our temper. Blame towards the other for them then losing their temper. Regret. Resentment. And that regret and resentment can carry on for years. Hours if we're lucky, when the belief of personal doership is in place. But years if it's a significant event. It can cloud our life experience, because at the root of that guilt and blame is an uncomfortableness with oneself. I shouldn't have done that. I could have done it differently. I'm not good enough. They shouldn't have done that. You know, how dare they? And if the belief in personal doership has dissolved, and we see that life happens in all sorts of ways, a myriad of ways, based on the myriad of different ways that we're designed. Only one way in each moment, so it only happens one way. Life happens one way in each moment. Infinite possibility, infinite potential in theory, but in practice only one actualization, because in the moment we are and the other is one way. So if that's deeply understood, anger happens and there's not a second thought about it. Someone says, why did you get angry? And inside you might be saying, what sort of question is that? Because inside you might know that there's just no other possibility that it could have turned out. Or inside you might have the answer, my genes and up-to-date conditioning. Or destiny. Or that's what happened. On the outside, you might come up with an explanation on the flow of life level. You go, oh yeah, I'm sorry I was tired. Could be, that's a part of the circumstance. So on an external explanation with people, we don't need to go around saying, well, it was all destined to happen according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. We can still say, I'm really sorry that I got angry then. But the guilt isn't there because we understand, yes, it was unfortunate, and that's why the apology happens. Yeah, I'm sorry that I got angry, but it doesn't mean that we're feeling guilty on a level of self, on the uncomfortable level of self. So that, in short, is an explanation of how we can start to see, following an intellectual understanding of the notion that the human being is one way in each moment, based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. As life happens, we might start to observe it and see that, yes, it's in line with the concept, and put ticks next to the concept. Each time a tick is next to the concept, meaning we've seen it for ourselves in practice, the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper. And after a month of just living your life normally, so you don't have to take any time out of work or your life to do this practice, you just live your life normally, and as you're going about the thing, you notice these feelings, these actions arising inside a body-mind organism. And go, look, of course, not great, but who I am. Might as well love myself. And the same for the other, obviously. You know, we don't get special exemption. The other is designed exactly, or on the same principle. They're not designed the same way, but the principle is the same. Genes and up-to-date conditioning. And, you know, after you've seen it and start seeing life this way for an extended period of time, at some point you look back and you think, how on earth could I have seen it differently? Like, I can't even remember how I used to see myself and the other as in control. And that means that it's not become second nature, it's become first nature. It's uprooted the old beliefs. And this isn't about putting in a new set of beliefs, this is about seeing things more clearly. And specifically, why is attention landing on this? It's landing on this because that person in history that has gone through the change and then looked at it and said, what has really changed? I mean, in practice, what's changed is I don't resist life, knowing that life is a happening, that life is destined to unfold in each moment exactly the way it does, based on the whole story and how everyone in each moment is designed. So resistance to life is seen as futile. What's the point of resisting? It's sort of like resisting two clouds coming across each other and try and say, no, go the other way, go the other way. Like if that was going to make a difference, then there's some purpose in it, maybe. But we find that it doesn't make a difference. It just disturbs the peace in the moment. The peace that is available even if circumstance is painful. And why is it that peace can be there even when circumstance is painful, even if we've recognized the other isn't the doer? Because if we recognize I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer, that's fair enough, but it doesn't stop life being painful. So why can I still be at peace even when life is painful? I can understand why I'm at peace because I'm not blaming the other and not blaming myself. But how can I be at peace with pain? How can I not resist the pain? And the answer is that we come to know that what we are at our core, meaning the whole human being, is not affected by circumstance. Meaning that what I am at my core is not touched by pain. And so with this understanding, my attitude is an attitude of experiencing the pain, but not having a story that says this pain is an attack on who I am. Not because I have a new story that says, like a mantra, this pain is not an attack on who I am, and it is, but I'm just bypassing the attack on who I am. This is a piece which is much more genuine in the sense it's not a mind-made piece. This is a piece that happens when the story that used to be in the mind is seen to be false. So we've talked about how the doership, meaning the blame and the guilt and the pride, is based on a false belief, a false story. So that falls away. And then as we find ourselves resting in being and finding ourselves complete, even in the face of someone letting us down, even in the face of us losing our job. So we get the information, you've lost your job. The story, oh my God, how am I going to survive? I can't believe that my boss has sacked me after all these years of work. They have no appreciation for all of the commitment I've put in. So all of that story has got a big uncomfortableness in it. And in a moment, if the thought I am, or whichever thought is loaded with the understanding, no, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. So that could be the thought, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. So in that moment, when we're resisting what's happening, blaming our boss, the thought, my happiness isn't to be found in alcohol, and we were, actually, we drop back into a place that has now become familiar with us, or familiar to us, this place outside of thinking, and we find, here I am. I just got the phone call saying I lost my job. And here I am. Like, this is not a thought, here I am. This is resting in my being. And someone says, you just got a phone call saying you lost your job and you don't seem concerned. You go, yeah, I know. I'll deal with that. And here I am. Like, I'll deal with it, but I'm still complete. This place of being is what is pointed at in Rumi's poem called There Is a Field, I think. I'm not a poet, I've never studied this, but I'll mess it up. Yes.
Beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. Only be there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full.
Yes. So beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, life is too full to even talk about. So the idea of this, the significant thing here is the ideas of right doing and wrong doing. This is the idea of what I need in order to be complete and what I don't need in order to be complete. It's the idea that I am the doer and I did wrong. You are the doer and you did wrong. I am the doer and I did right. You are the doer and you did right. It's the falling away of this belief in personal doing and seeing myself as the doer and the other as the doer. So beyond the ideas of right doing and wrong doing, so when we drop into being, we find there's a field of being. And I'll meet you there means this is where two people can know each other. This is where two people are not creating self-images of themselves and the other and what the other needs to deliver to them. It's like we drop into being. This is where two people can meet. And when the soul lies in that grass, life is too full. It means that my being is self-content and complete. Like, too full to talk about means I don't need anything more. I don't need to ask any questions.
Even the word each other doesn't make any sense.
So, because there's no microphone there, even the statement, even the
words each other doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Even the words each other doesn't make any sense.
Yes. And in the Bible story of Adam and Eve, which is where the fall from grace happens. And in the story, I see that as a metaphor, not as a sort of depiction, a story, a metaphor of how suffering came into being. And the normal interpretation of what it all means is different to what I see it as. So the way I see it is that Adam and Eve find themselves in the Garden of Eden with everything they need, not feeling like anything is missing. Living essentially as two people, two humans. And somewhere along the line, they get tempted by the snake, by the serpent. And the serpent is just part of the metaphor that gets the brain asking questions. So the serpent says, why is it that God has forbidden you to eat that, what right does he have to forbid you to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? It's a very specific tree. Not just say an apple, right? It's the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so the way I see this is that the serpent is part of the circumstance. And then based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning and this new information, a whole lot of thinking might start. They might start saying, yes, why is it that we're forbidden to eat it? And so it's not really about their doing. So when the eating of the apple happens at some point, normally it's seen to be, that's when they failed. But the way I see it is, it's destiny unfolding, that they were always destined to eat the apple, given their genes, their makeup, and the circumstance they found themselves in. If the serpent had kept his mouth shut, right, it would have been different. The fact is he didn't. And Adam and Eve in the story, I'm not advocating any particular religion, all of the wisdom teachings have great metaphors in them, and hopefully we can see, without our bias against particular religions, what's being pointed at. And so Adam and Eve weren't in control of what the serpent said to them. Once the serpent said what he had said, it couldn't be unsaid. It was there in their system. And so now the thinking happened based on their new conditioning and their makeup at that point in time. And at some point, it led to the reaching for the apple and the eating. And the eating, this is significant, they've now eaten from the tree, or the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So that suggests, once again, and that's the point when there is a fall from grace. The fall from grace wasn't because they disobeyed God's order and God was now angry because they disobeyed God's order. The fall from grace was because they had eaten a particular fruit that gave them something, the knowledge of good and evil. So that's an idea comparative to the right doing and wrong doing, like what is good and what is bad. But not what is good and what is bad in the sense that we become responsible humans because now I know what is good and bad. This is something that leads to suffering. This is something that leads to judgment and seeing the other as inappropriate as a human being on a fundamental level. So this is very much to do with, it could be the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of right doings and wrong doings. And so at that point, they suddenly lost connection with themselves because they had this idea of who they are and what they need. And with this self-image, they became self-conscious, meaning they lost the comfortableness that was there from knowing themselves truly. So as soon as the mind starts creating this false idea that I am the doer and the other is the doer, then everything starts going wrong. It's the fall from grace. And then the natural abundance that we have is lost, and we feel like we now are no longer in the Garden of Eden. And so from that point on, what would happen in the story is suffering and then a process of transformation. So they would come across a spiritual teaching, and the spiritual teaching will start to uproot the knowledge of good and evil. Until at some point the false understanding is completely uprooted and there is a reawakening to the true nature of the human being, something that is full and unaffected by circumstance, and sees the other as an instrument through which life is happening, sees ourself as an instrument through which life is happening. So where do we go? Rumi, Sufi, yeah? Islam. Now we had Christianity and / Judaism, the Old Testament. And now we need Hinduism, or Hindu. So Shiva, yes, we can use Arjuna and Krishna. In the Bhagavad Gita, there is the story of Arjuna and Krishna. And Lord Krishna is counseling Arjuna as he recognizes he's about to go into battle and sees on the other side that his enemy is his family, his friends, his mentors and gurus. And he says to Lord Krishna, I can't fight that enemy. They're not my enemy. And Arjuna says, maybe my family and friends, but my gurus and mentors, I can't. And Krishna, as the voice of wisdom, says, you are a warrior, you must fight. Meaning you've been designed a particular way and you have a particular role to play in this story of life. So you are a warrior, you must fight. And as time, I have already killed them. Meaning as the story of life, you are just an instrument through which an outcome is brought about. You're not the doer. I am the doer as time, as the story of life. And we hear in all of the religions, you have the right to action, but you don't have the right to the fruit of your action. What it really means is that in each moment you will act according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning, what you can call your free will, because it feels like you're doing, feels like your free will. When you really look at it, you find it's much less your doing than it feels like. And so this feeling of free will is a gift. It's what makes us feel in this experience of life that I'm not a slave, that I'm not a puppet at the end of a string. And at some point we might come to see, oh, actually my free will and God's will are not two. It's not that we say, I don't have free will, everything is God's will. Or nothing is God's will, it's all my free will. We can come to see that God's will unfolds in each moment by me doing exactly what I think or feel to do. My free will in each moment to do exactly what I think or feel to do. In this moment I feel like I can move my hand to the left or to the right. And I do. And how much of my doing is it? When I look at it closely, I find it's not my doing, it's a happening. But in practice, it feels like my free will, and I'm very happy for that sense. I'm very happy for the dual recognition that it's my free will in each moment, but my free will is actually God's will. So my free will and God's will turn out not to be two, which is the same for everyone. Life is clearly not a creation that is created to be all love or all peaches and cream. Life is a creation of duality, of interconnected opposites. So if there is health, there needs to be disease. If there's wealth, there needs to be poverty. Up, down, big, small, male, female. Good and evil. So this good and evil is not what we were talking about before. Life is a duality. It will always be experienced as a duality. The difference is between dualism and duality. Dualism is our attitude that attributes personal doership and judgment to the duality. So the fact that life is a duality is not the problem. Life is not going to, or suffering isn't going to end when life is no longer a duality. Life ends when dualism falls away.
I just have a question about the Hindu story, where you said that Krishna told him that you have to fight, and in time they are already killed.
And as time, I have already killed them.
Yeah, but wouldn't that say like that in one way, in like everything has already happened? And isn't that like eternity? In one way, like in our life, like everything is destined to unfold in exactly one way.
Yes.
And it has already happened.
Yep. So life is predetermined.
Yeah, but it's just strange to think about, like everything's already been done forever and ever.
Once again, these are pointers. They're concepts. They are not necessarily truth. In fact, nothing that anyone has ever said or written is the truth. They're all concepts. They happen to be very useful concepts, and some of them actually accurate depictions of life. So someone might say, well, I don't believe that everything is predetermined. I don't believe that everything has already happened. And if we only present that concept without any explanation, then it might just require someone to believe it. And to believe something without evidence isn't always wise. Actually, the process sometimes works very well when we believe something without evidence, because that belief uproots a previous belief. But at some point, that new belief needs to be corrected, because if we go around with a belief, we're not really free. And so if someone said to me, well, because I do often say that life is predetermined, life is a story unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. And so someone said, tell me, what do you mean by life is predetermined? Or I don't agree that life is predetermined. What's your rationale on saying that life is predetermined? I'd say, well, from several different perspectives. One, if there is a witnessing that happens, a shift whereby the sense of who you are very clearly rests and watches that life happens without you doing anything, without the controller being in charge. It witnesses life as a happening and recognizes that the body moves based on its biological conditioning. So even once the doer stops, the body still has its biological preferences, and it's always going to move towards its biological preferences, and that's what allows life to continue happening, even without the doer or a doer being active. In fact, a doer has never been what has driven the human being. The human being has always functioned based on its biological movement. So from that perspective, we might see, oh, what I thought was my doing is actually a happening. And that happening is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning that are a result of everything that came before. So what happens in this moment is actually not separate, not isolated from everything that came before.
And everything that comes after.
And everything that came after. So the action in this moment becomes part of what affects what comes next. And so if we see this, we might see, well, of course, it's a continuation that started with the initial impulse that I didn't control, that the other didn't control, that the whole world essentially started with the initial impulse and is still moving, what we're sort of surfing the wave of unfoldment. We are, this moment is the very front of the wave of unfoldment. And from that point of view, we can see that even before, or as soon as if you take the billiard balls, snooker balls on a table, that as soon as the initial impulse happens, the cue hits the white ball and the white ball hits the red balls, the initial energy is then transferred and is in motion in that closed environment of the snooker table. And at some point when that energy is expended, everything comes to rest. And we don't need things to come to a rest to know that they will come to a rest exactly as they're destined to come to a rest, based on the laws of the environment that everything is happening in. And so this predetermined notion is not as esoteric as it seems. In fact, Stephen Hawking has written an essay that Ramesh came across once, and Ramesh was really pleased to come across this essay. And the essay is entitled, "Is Everything Predetermined?" And Stephen Hawking has come up with his conclusion based on physics and mathematics, which Ramesh didn't take as necessarily proof, but he was very happy to find that his intuition and conclusion was supported by mathematics and physics, whereas his conclusion had nothing to do with mathematics and physics. And the essay starts off like this: "Is everything predetermined? ? Yes, it is. Full stop, I think. And then new sentence. However, knowing that everything is predetermined doesn't allow us to know what is predetermined, which is our experience in life."
I just have a question to this, like, if we gain more knowledge about like how the brain functions and like physics and like about everything, like in theory it could be possible to predict.
It's possible, it's definitely possible to predict, except we simply, and that's happening now, the people have models, governments have models, economic models, war models, population models, and it works on the principle of sticking in variables and sticking in observed laws of how certain things affect certain things. And then the model tells us what will end up. Now, because the models aren't capable of understanding all of the variables in life, the models are not going to be able to predict with certainty. If we, in theory, if we had a computer that could have all of the variables from the beginning of time, it would, ahead of time, or at the same time, be predicting exactly what is happening in each moment. This based on the assumption that this is a closed environment and everything is part of the laws that govern the environment. And thinking, according to a documentary of Stephen Hawking's also that I saw, and the reason I refer to is he's a preeminent physicist. He doesn't make statements that haven't undergone certain critical thinking tests and observation test. This is not at all, don't mistake me saying that science has some absolute answers, but it's great to start seeing that this basic principle, which is the root of our suffering, is actually confirmed and confirmable as an error based on some basic observations. And then when more complex observations using much more high-tech equipment take place, the conclusion is the same. So that's just a supporting bit of information. And so in this documentary, because we often might think, yeah, but this closed system has this wildcard variable, which is me. Like, don't forget about me, that is the doer, unaffected by anything else. I'm isolated. I'm a wild card in this system. And even if you were a wild card, it wouldn't change the fact that things are predetermined. They're just predetermined depending on what the wild card does in each moment. Right? But the fact is that when we look at it, this wild card doesn't exist. This independent, isolated entity doesn't exist. In the documentary, Stephen Hawking said, make no mistake that thinking is just physics. Thinking is electromagnetic movements in a neural network. And so what we believe is my thought generated out of my independent volition as a separate being, this is the belief of the doer, that entity simply doesn't exist. When we look inside, we don't find the entity. What we find is a biological instrument that is functioning according to the laws of the universe. And so the thoughts that seem random to us are not at all random at all. They're a result of everything that came before.
This thing about technology advancing enough to be able to predict the future events precisely, like there's a mathematical limitation that doesn't allow us to do that. Probably worth just considering that, because even that doesn't tell us that it's not predetermined. It just sets a limit on how precisely we can measure the current moment, because that determines all the variable accuracy to determine the next moment.
Right. So it just says we can't predict it. It doesn't say it's not predetermined.
Yes, it doesn't say that it's not predetermined. I mean, so sometimes
in fact, it's not that it doesn't. It's not that it doesn't say. The principle will support that it is predetermined.
Yes.
The scientific observation, from the observer point of view, it might be random.
Yes.
But the observer is actually part of the movement itself. And so that the fact that it seems random from the observer's point of view doesn't make it random.
Right. I mean, mathematically it says it's random, not random. I mean, yeah, there is a certain amount of randomness at a very like subatomic level, which first of all averages itself out at a macro level. So it's irrelevant when you're looking at macro events like movement and thinking and all that. But even at the subatomic level, the uncertainty or the randomness is like a not knowable from within the closed system of the universe. That doesn't necessarily make it truly random.
That's right. So from behind the scenes, what seems random from this side of the screen may not at all be random from the other side, if it was able to be observed from the other side, which it's not.
Right. And randomness also is not, even if it was true, is not evidence of independent free will, because if it's truly random, then you still don't have control. You know?
Sure. Yeah. The trouble we have, this is a good thing, is even if we can't prove the opposite, what just doesn't make sense is control. So when we look at it from a very rudimentary point of view, in each moment we find ourselves faced with a situation, decisions get made, there is choice. Choice happens. When we look at it more accurately, we'll find choice happens, but it wasn't my choice as a separate independent doer. So to deny choice happens is to not see things as they unfold, because you find yourself in a restaurant, you look at the menu, there's 10 items on the menu, and at some point, one item is picked. So that we can call choice. It happens. When we look at it more closely, we see the choice is based on the person as they are in that moment, their genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the environment that they found themselves in, an environment that they weren't in control of. They weren't in control of what they see, what they smell, taste, touch, or hear. And the menu card is part of what they see. And the feelings that are invoked based on when they're seeing the menu card is also something that happens not because of the individual's doing, but rather a reaction to the circumstance. And at some point, one item, one option is picked. So that we can say is choice. And we look at it as just described and we say, oh, it's not my choice, but rather choice happening as part of life, based on two factors I haven't ever been in control of, my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And then once the choice is made, the outcome, never in our control. So the waiter takes the order, goes into the kitchen, 10 minutes later comes back and says, I'm very sorry, but there's no orange juice. You ordered orange juice, there's no orange juice, so you'll have to order something else. Or he comes back with a nice glass of orange juice. And even if he comes back with a glass of orange juice, when you taste it, it may taste bad, or it may taste good. So the outcome, never in your control. Choice in the moment, yes. That choice even comes with the added benefit of the feeling of free will. And when we look deeper, we find that that choice turns out not to be my choice, but rather choice happening. So this notion of control is very hard to support when we look at life on even just a rudimentary way. And then as we look at it in more and more detail, we find that what appears on the surface, on the very surface, primarily because of the feeling of free will, what appears to be my doing turns out on a simple observation not to be your doing, and on a very detailed observation not your doing. So hopefully, let's not get too far off track. Remember, what we're really looking for in life is happiness, keeping it very practical. We're not looking for truth, we're not looking for enlightenment. We're not looking for a word or some concept. We know this when we find ourselves really unhappy in life. And someone says, what are you looking for? You know, you're not going to say, I'm looking for truth. You go, I just want this feeling of uncomfortableness to not be here. So we're really looking for happiness. Happiness turns out not to be happiness through outcomes. We've had outcomes our whole life. We've had positive outcomes, and positive outcomes don't deliver us ongoing happiness. So we can put a tick next to the concept, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. We've received more than enough outcomes, more than enough pleasure to know that my happiness isn't to be found there. And we might start having the experience when the thinking mind starts to get cut off, that we find ourselves at peace, which turns out to be what happiness for the human being is, at peace, even when circumstance is painful. So we can put another tick from the other direction. My happiness isn't to be found in circumstance. My happiness isn't to be found in pleasure. Because one, I've got all the pleasures that or not all the pleasures, but some of the pleasures that I wanted, and it didn't give me lasting happiness. And my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure, because even when there is pain, if my movement is towards resting in being, I find experientially I'm at peace even when there is pain in the moment.
So in a way, like, everyone is an enlightened being and that we're all trying to dissociate from our discomfort. It's why we do things that in the moment aren't always that good for us, is because it ceases the uncomfortableness momentarily. So I have a great respect for each of us, because it's like we are each doing the best we can to reduce our uncomfortableness, because in essence we know that's not our true nature.
Yes.
But we're still attached on people, places, things, specific actions to alleviate this discomfort, and thus we never actually exit it. It's like, this constant that was just a...
Yeah. And what we find is that often what we're doing to alleviate it is never really an alleviation of it, but a distraction of it. So we seek after temporary hits of pleasure, because sometimes when we get those hits of pleasure, the suffering comes to an end just for a little bit. It gets cut off, because the thinking says, oh, I've received pleasure, I must be okay. So it cuts off the I'm not okay. But it doesn't really address the root of the issue, which is the false belief that I am something that's incomplete.
Could be actually reinforcing the opposite belief, isn't it? Because it says, oh, I got this, so I'm okay now. So maybe if I try harder, I'll be okay next time too. Something.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
So you're saying it can reinforce the false belief, because when it appears that the suffering gets cut off and it appears now fulfilled because of pleasure, it will reinforce the seeking after pleasure, thinking, okay, if I can get enough pleasure, then I will be okay on a continuous basis. The fact is we can never get life to turn out so that it's pleasure, 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 pleasure. The nature of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. And furthermore, even if we could get life to be pleasure, 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 what would happen is that pleasure would become normalized, and the underlying uncomfortableness, which is not a result of missing pleasure, but actually not knowing ourselves, would then bubble to the surface, and we would simply need to get more pleasure of a more intense sort. And so you're right, that can reinforce the problem. And so recognition of these dynamics, the subtle dynamics, because as you said, we're all doing our best because we believe that our happiness is to be found in love from the other. We believe that our happiness is to be found in outcomes and pleasure. And so we're forced to try and control life such that it delivers these things. And then when it doesn't, we're going to feel frustrated by what we see the other has done to get in the way of me gaining what I think I need to be complete.
Today I found a gem. This is going to sound like a very unenlightened question, and it felt so good. And I have like a body that needs to like run or dance.
Can you turn the microphone up?
Today I found a gym, and I was running, and it felt like so great because I haven't been moving a lot the last couple weeks, and I'm just the type of have a body where like I guess biologically I'm programmed that I need to like run or dance or have movement in me like every day, and it was like such a relief to my entire nervous system to be moving like this. But then because of these satsangs, I thought. And I've also often wondered, how come other people don't need this? I mean, some people do, but a lot of people, I have relatives or friends who don't seem to need that. And then I thought, oh my gosh, like, this is just my personal biology and up-to-date conditioning. I don't know, I just had this different perspective about some of my needs, so to speak, that I hadn't really perceived before. Like, I just assumed that is good and healthy and right, versus this is just one way that I'm wired and it suits this being. Rather than this is like a protocol that everyone should be following.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'll be controversial. You know, there's some people are vegetarian, and that's great for the animals.
I am.
Yeah. And then without an understanding of this, there might be a confusion as why someone else isn't vegetarian. Because for the person that finds themselves able to be vegetarian, it may not just be a psychological relationship to animals, but it might be something that their body also supports. So genetically, their body might not call for meat. And this is just a suggestion, I'm not saying it is definitely this way, but it's worth considering. Could it be that some people's bodies, along the lines that you've mentioned, actually instructs through a feeling, says, I need this, based on maybe historically how the body, this particular body has grown up. Not just in this life, but the genes might have come from people that only had a diet of meat, and so the genes, as a result of the environment, adapted to that diet. And so someone might want to be a vegetarian, and their body is not allowing that to happen easily. And so this could just be an explanation. So it's part of my biological makeup. So let's leave that aside, because ethically it's going to trigger a whole lot of things in people. But as soon as you see that both psychologically and biologically my movements are dictated, my feelings are dictated by these two factors, then the judgment of yourself, the understanding of yourself, the judgment can fall away and the understanding can be there. This is why I'm like this. This is why sometimes I wake up in the morning and I'm debilitated with depression. Because that's my makeup. And this isn't saying this in order for someone to become complacent. This is saying it for someone to stop resisting and then in each moment do the best you can without creating a psychological resistance to something that can't be overcome in that moment. So it's about a surrender or an acceptance, but that acceptance isn't an acceptance that is meant to make us complacent or inhumane. So in each moment, life happens. A water pipe might burst in your house or in your garden, and there's an acceptance that the pipe has burst and this is an inconvenience, this is pain in the moment to me. That acceptance doesn't mean that I'll then just sit there and watch the water pipe and say, well, I've accepted, it's happened. Acceptance in the next moment can turn into an action to do what one can to fix the situation. So accept in one moment, and then the new moment is do in that moment whatever you think or feel to do.
Okay, this is perfect, because I had a really quick follow-up to Vilda and Vikram's question. So going back to the Krishna story and the idea that you're a warrior, that's who you are, that's who you're destined to be. You might not be.
Arjuna was.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the story.
Yeah.
Not me. Are you saying I'm not a warrior? No, in the story. So, but Juno, is that how I said it? He also had the capacity to say, yes, Krishna, I am a warrior, and I choose not to fight this war against these people. Like he has, I mean, I get what the story is pointing to, that you are what you are, and and that is what you are. But you also, I mean, there also is like, and the follow-up to that is, when we say everything is predetermined, it is, quote, God's will. So I think about someone who dies in their bathroom from a drug overdose or whatever. Like, is it really God's will that we don't awaken? Is it really God's will that these tragedies or these lonelinesses or these isolations ensue? Like, if consciousness is continuously being upgraded, which I believe would be God's will, then eventually we'd get to a point or this would not exist, or these tragic stories that tragic from our perception, my perception, wouldn't exist, because you can't die from a drug overdose or from certain actions that look like they're done by self. If consciousness has upgraded to such a point in human culture. So I just feel, like he, quote, had a moment of choice where he could say, I am a warrior, but I don't want to fight. And B, is it really God's will that our suffering takes place? And don't we have the capacity to upgrade?
So what you're a warrior means, so that was more like a description. Arjuna, Krishna was describing, you're a warrior, you're not going to say no. You're going to say, yes, I will fight, because you're a warrior.
He could say, I'm a warrior, but I won't fight this battle.
But he didn't say that. If he said, I'm a warrior and I won't fight, he's not a warrior. So this is a description that says, you are a warrior, you are going to fight. If you weren't a warrior, I might say you're a warrior, and you might say, no, I'm not actually. Or, but Krishna wouldn't say you're a warrior if you're not a warrior. And this is Krishna seeing things as they are. He's saying, you are a warrior, you will fight. I have made you a warrior, I have made you fight. As time, I have made you a warrior. As the story of time. As the story of, I have made you a warrior, I have made you fight, and I have made you kill those that as time I have already killed. And if Arjuna says or does anything anywhere, it's because as time, Krishna has made that part of the story of time. That's what that story in the Bhagavad Gita is pointing at. It does say that you have choice, but the fruits of your choice are not yours to claim. And if we look at it, we'll see that what it's saying earlier on is that your choice is my doing as Krishna, as a representation of God, is that your choice is part of the story of time, and in a causal point of view, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, the warrior genes and up-to-date conditioning.
I'm just saying, and I know I'm sort of missing the point, and I get where the moral of the story is pointing to. I'm just saying, he could say, I love these people and I will not fight them.
If it's destined as part of the story of time, that means if he's destined in that moment for his genes and up-to-date conditioning to prevent him from fighting, that's exactly what he would say.
Since he had the capacity to ask the question in the first place.
He had the capacity to ask the question based on his genes and up-to-date conditioning.
That goes against my up-to-date conditioning of love, my perception of love.
Yeah.
Okay, and then also I was reading this morning about karma, this big word, loaded word, karma, and that every moment of your life you perform action, physically, mentally, emotionally, and energy-wise. Each action creates a certain memory. That memory is karma.
Yes. So the interpretation from my understanding, right? In each moment we are acting. That's what it says, right?
Yeah. In each moment of your life, you perform action physically, mentally, emotionally, and energy-wise.
Yeah. So, and then it says that those actions
create a memory.
Create
and
a
that
memory.
memory is karma.
And that memory is karma. So basically, it's talking about cause and effect, action, reaction. Karma, in its non-personal interpretation, simply means cause and effect, or action, reaction.
The translation is causality.
Causality. So all of life is karma. What the doer belief has done is turned impersonal causality impersonal karma into a story of personal karma.
Which makes people afraid. Like, I've done this action and so therefore something terrible will happen.
Well, it could mean, because that's karma, but not your karma, as you as a separate independent entity haven't orchestrated that negative action. It has happened through you. And as a result of that, there will be a consequence. That's the law of the universe. Cause and effect. Action, reaction. Events, consequences. Or deeds and consequences. But if that happens and there is a consequence, the doer will see it as my karma to receive punishment for something I have done wrong. If you look at that as a description, you'll see that basically it's saying everything that came before created a memory, and that memory has then become the basis on which the next action that we are always doing in life, which is the beginning of the thing, happens. And then those words and those actions and deeds create a consequence. That consequence is received as new conditioning, meaning the action creates a reaction, which is the moment, the situation in this moment. And that becomes new conditioning that updates our existing conditioning. So the memory that's what it's referring to, creates a memory. It creates a change inside of us. And so as a result of that memory, that change, we will then be designed a certain way to act, speak in the next moment.
And if we want to break it?
You can't. The law of karma will be there for as long as life is happening, because life is karma. So in the non-dual wisdom traditions, it says that the body of a sage, so the body of an enlightened person, will continue to have its body karma. But the sage is free of karma. What does that mean? It means the sage's attitude is no longer an attitude that claims ownership of the karma as my karma. So the body karma continues. The attitude of non-doership no longer recognizes that karma as my karma. So if we interpret it, if we hear it, the sage has no karma, we suddenly might think, oh, the sage has ended his karma. It's just an attitudinal shift.
Or he has perfect action, therefore he has...
Not at all. That might be our interpretation. A sage doesn't become a perfect human being. A sage continues to act according to his biological genes and up-to-date conditioning. The idea that enlightenment delivers a perfect human being is based on the attachment to outcomes that we have. So we have an imagination of what enlightenment is. Pleasure, 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 pleasure. Completely off track. So the sage continues to be an imperfect human being, continues to function according to his body's karma, and attitudinally is free from the suffering of judging himself and judging others. Free from identifying with the karma that the body receives as being something that determines his completeness, his happiness.
And what about all the apparent unnecessary suffering, or people who die and don't,
Unnecessary from a certain perspective, right? From the perspective of seeing life as a creation that is not a creation of love and light, not a creation of peaches and cream, pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. From the perspective of seeing life as a duality, wealth and poverty, health and disease, good and evil. So that explains the suffering and the unfortunate circumstance we see in life. And from that perspective, it doesn't make it unnecessary. It makes it completely part of life.
So, sorry, I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole, but if someone dies in this life in a seemingly unfortunate way, and then that energy is perhaps rebirthed in a different form, then, I mean, do you believe that we keep coming back, like our energy being keeps coming back until we get it, so to speak? And that's why I say, oh, you've lived many lives. Roger, you've lived many lives.
You could say that the energy of doership and attachment to outcome can be seen to be stored, let's say, after the body dies. This is just a concept, right? Where the energy of doership and attachment to outcome is stored and is then distributed into a new incarnation. And what I mean by energy is stored is not the soul, but the data that is the unresolved fears, the unresolved talents, the unresolved desires. That is basically an energetic load, is stored on the cloud, right? So it's just data. It's not a soul. And then when a new incarnation comes in, we could say that the story of life is a very complex plot that has been designed to unfold according to certain rules. And let's say the rules are that this stored, unresolved energy needs to be resolved in the story of life. And so it gets included in a new birth as part of its genes and up-to-date conditioning. And then that new birth is forced to act according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning, which will include a load of unresolved fears and desires and talents.
Multiple sources.
Just to prevent any confusion that someone might have of a transmigrating soul, we can say that the data from one unresolved, or from one birth, the unresolved energy, could get spread into several incarnations, several new births. That will break the obsession that we have of a transmigrating soul.
Past life regression?
So if someone has been, is destined to be born with this, let's say, unresolved energy, it could be that in their life, the vision, which is we can that framework that can hold the notion of unresolved energies from another birth, someone else's life, not my past life. Roger only exists now. Roger has never lived before. Roger is a result of consciousness functioning through this particular body-mind organism. So Roger hasn't had past lives. Other lives have been lived, let's say, and energy from that, unresolved energy from that life gets stored, and somehow, as part of the intricate experience of life, seems to get deposited so that it can get resolved.
This makes, so just really quickly, this makes like so much sense to me, because like certain things where like you're born and you can play the piano, but you've never really had a lesson. Mm-hmm. Or I know like for me growing up, I had all these habits and things, ways of being that had nothing to do with my conditioning in this life. But then when I came to India, I was doing things that families do in India. And my family always thought I had some kind of weird issue. But I came here and it was quite normal. And I felt very comfortable in that way. So, I mean, and I mean, I've heard so many people say things where we have these experiences that are not associated with this lifetime, but clearly come from another time and space.
Mm-hmm. But we have to be careful not to turn this into some big story of, to me, it's, but I would say that break it down and just say it's genes and up-to-date conditioning. The up-to-date conditioning is all of the conditioning from the past. And this energy would be essentially conditioning from the past. And we can keep it not so personal.
Actually, I just wanted to share my impression. I think that this kind of story, you call it story, has a tendency of being unknowingly speculative. And I think that's actually the opposite of why we meet here. I think we meet here somehow, you say we don't meet for truth, that's okay with me, but at least we meet for happiness, and happiness based not on speculation. Mm-hmm. Happiness based on what we can perceive, what we can sense with all we have, with the whole body. Mm-hmm. But I think it always has to be somehow grounded, not in wishes, but in things we can sense.
Yeah, so the framework that I put forward is completely based on my own experience, right? And so when certain content of my experience started happening, it became part of my contemplation, like how does this all link in together? And so then the framework needed to have a place for these visions, let's say, which happened over extended periods of time. And some of them, one in particular, there were many visions of, and the story unfolded over the course of about 4 years, where I came to understand the full story of this particular man over the course of 4 years. And it explained a lot of things that I previously didn't have an explanation for. Having said that, my way of relating to this was one of not drawing absolute conclusions. So as far as I could see, it was just an experience happening in this moment. Now, I didn't say that because I have a memory in this moment, it proves that that life existed. Like, I don't know if that life existed. What I do know is that there were visions and emotions linked to those visions that were very intense, that I couldn't explain as being of my life. They very much were linked to a story that was presenting itself, a vision, like a dream, that was happening in the waking state, while the body was releasing a lot of energy, you could say. And so then it had to fit into my conceptual framework as a concept. So it definitely doesn't get related to by me as truth. But for me to ignore aspects of what were my first-hand experience would mean that I'd have a framework that then didn't really hold my complete experience. So I completely agree with you. That's why I'm a bit careful, is that often people have the tendency to believe a story as absolute, even if they don't have the first-hand experience of something like this. And so I would say that it's quite possible that someone maybe doesn't have any past life energy, and they only have their genes and up-to-date conditioning of this life. And maybe no one has any past life memories. Maybe that doesn't exist. Maybe what I experienced was a combination of a whole lot of other factors that appeared to indicate this. And so if it doesn't fit your experience, I would say adjust the model, which in this case is very adjustable because it's still genes and up-to-date conditioning, but limited to your life experience. And if at some point in the future you suddenly have an experience that you're very unfamiliar with, and maybe this tends to be a dynamic that happens. We are unfamiliar with something and we hear someone describing it and we really think that they're a little bit flaky, right? Because they describe something and you say, come on, use some critical thinking, and which, you know, I actually say that to people because I see people don't use critical thinking. But suddenly if you as a person who is very clear on this, not turning something into a story in an unfounded way, if suddenly that happens to you and you go, oh wow, now I see it. Now, no, yeah.
No, actually, I'm a fan of this, and I have I wouldn't say many, but a few of interesting experiences in the realm of family constellation work.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is something I can go into a system and I can experience something directly.
Yes.
So, and this kind of close relationship to, and close also, and like biologically close and locally close. So people who are somehow part of my system.
Mm-hmm.
This is something I have experienced a lot, and I have seen a lot, and I see the effect worldwide and research. So that I wouldn't say that an individual is isolated from its past, not at all.
Mm-hmm.
We are deeply interlinked to our past. It was just the wish to de-storify.
Yes, to keep us grounded. Yeah, which I condone full-heartedly. Yeah, we should stay with the facts of our own experience. Yeah, and even sometimes our own experience, our brain very much interprets it in a way that someone else would say, so why do you interpret it that way? Why not interpret it this way? So we should also really question our conclusions about experiences. Yeah.
Yes, and without mystery, then what's the point? So facts and living in the mystery, that's what makes a mystic. You know, that's what makes Rumi. That's what makes Hafiz, and life would be so dull without that.
Yes, true. Thank you.